May 4th, 1970, the nation is shocked by the shootings at the Kent State University in Ohio. There are two questions on everybody's mind. How did this happen, and how are rights and responsibilities being stretched in America?
Tin soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, for dead in Ohio.
Vietnam in 1970 is hell on earth. The troop level has just reached a record amount and there's no signs of the war slowing down. One event, though, would change the course of the war and history. Americans aren't happy about the war in Vietnam and they're using their rights to fight it. Finally, President Nixon gives in to the protesters' demands, but at a price. May 1st, 1970.
I announced the decision to withdraw an additional 150,000 Americans from Vietnam over the next year.
With the good news out of the way, Nixon sets in.
In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border.
Within hours, troops are on the ground in Cambodia and begin to get contact. Protesters across America were infuriated at what appeared to be the expansion of the Vietnam War. Soon the protests spread to the campuses. At Kent State University, an anti-war protest of 500 students is taking place. The protest went well and the students rushed back to class. The trouble really started that night. That night, drunks started throwing beer bottles at cop cars. This started a riot. A crowd of 120 people was eventually dispersed, but the riot would cause one of the most famous shootings in history. May 2nd, 1970. On May 2nd, the protests started getting out of hand. Thousands of protesters were gathering on campus. Protesters went and burned down the ROTC building on campus before the National Guard could be brought in. That afternoon, crowds were dispersed with tear gas. May 4th, 1970. After a peaceful day on May 3rd, things started to ramp up again. After the burning of the ROTC building and the riots, Kent State was in trouble and the National Guard was called in. The National Guard arrived just as a major protest on campus reached 1,500 people. The National Guard used tear gas and attempted to clear out the protesters from the green. They were met with rocks and angry shouting. Then, at 12:24, Sergeant Myron Pryor wheeled around and began firing at the protesters with his Colt 1911 pistol. "28 other guardsmen also fired with M1 Garand rifles. They fired 69 rounds in total. The nation is shocked by the shootings. Newspapers rage at the shootings with the news of the 4 deaths and 9 wounded. Soon it's being referred to as the Kent State Massacre. What most don't realize is that the Kent State shooting was actually the result of an overstretch of both rights to protest and the responsibility to protect the public. The Kent State shooting not only impacted the students present, but the nation as a whole. We went to the director of the School of Policy and International Affairs, retired Navy Captain James Headley, to find out more on the impact of the Kent State shootings.
Well, it had a huge impact on the general public. That was out May 4th, 1970, and the day after they shut down. I mean, it was a nationwide strike by students and universities and colleges around the country. They shut down like 120 some incredible number of universities, just shut them down. So right away, absolutely impactful.
Word spread really quickly about what had taken place at Kent State, and that there would be a meeting down by the Library Mall, that everybody knew about, that there would be a meeting sometime that evening to talk about what we could do. And I remember attending that along with some of my friends from the dorm, and it was packed. There must have been tens of thousands of students. In Madison, at least, there was a very strong reaction to the Kent State incident. And it led to several days of demonstrations, and there was an effort to close the university down. And like many campuses, The response of the administration was to first obviously call in the university police, then the city police, and then eventually the National Guard. Wisconsin National Guard was called in to stabilize the situation. The bringing in of the National Guard, because of the similarity with Kent State, right? Because it was the National Guard that had shot into the students at Kent State, led to confrontations in Madison. And I distinctly remember being part of peace marches, and there was tear gas and chaos, and so there were major upheavals that went on. And although technically the university was open and classes were going on, virtually nobody went to class.
We went back to James Sedley to find out if the shootings had an impact on the Vietnam War.
Did it contribute? I think Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense of infamy, said that yes, it did contribute. And I think a gentleman named Alderman, who we may remember from Watergate readings, also said that it did contribute to the beginning of us pulling back and pulling out of Vietnam. I think pulling out of Vietnam at that point was inevitable, but this probably, hopefully got, and for me, my heroes said are some of the POWs that were in Vietnam at the time, and it got those guys home a little bit sooner than I think it would have.
Obviously, the Kent State shootings had made a large effect. It shows that when rights and responsibilities are stretched, it can make a large impact in history. But before we make conclusions, we have to examine when rights and responsibilities were being stretched. First, were the protesters stretching their rights? And were the National Guard's responsibilities being stretched by being called in? Because of the burning of the ROTC building, the protesters were stretching their rights too far. This is also why the National Guard was in the right by being called in. So, when were the responsibilities of the National Guard being stretched too far? We went back to James Sedley to find out.
I think all the actions were justified except for shooting into the crowd, because there's a number of different actions they went through. There was, and in fact, the question still remains today. It'll remain forever. Were their lives in danger? And actually, believe it or not, federal court, criminal court, and federal civil court cases found in favor of the National Guardsmen.
The Kent State shootings will always be an example of what happens when the responsibility to protect and the right to protest get mixed the wrong way. Sadly, this example came at the price of the lives of 4 protesters. It remains a valuable lesson in today's world with the protests that are taking place. It also put a new focus on the need for better crowd control. Kent State will live on as a reminder of why rights and responsibilities are so important and why they are so close together. Sadly, no one will probably ever know the full story of the Kent State shootings.